Hello, scientific writers. In a previous video, we talked about predatory journals. I'll have a link to that video down in the description. It's really hard sometimes to classify a journal as predatory or not predatory because there is a spectrum of behaviors. The question I want to discuss in this video is, can mainstream elite journals be considered predatory? Hi guys, this is Brian from the Grants and Publications YouTube channel. Thanks for joining me today. Let's start off by defining predator. What is a predator? So if we look in the Merriam-Webster dictionary online, the first version is what you think of. A predator is an animal that eats other animals. But the second definition is the one I want to focus on. This definition for predator is one who injures or exploits others for personal gain or profit. So we can change personal for business. A business who injures or exploits others for business gain or profit is a predator. All right, so keep that definition in mind. The question I would like to ask is, are scientific researchers vulnerable to exploitation when it comes to publishing their papers? Well, I'd like to make a few key points and support them with evidence. All of my sources are in the description below, so if you'd like to dig a little bit deeper, go down to that description and take a look. First, many scientists believe that publications in high impact factor journals are key to the career that they want. Now, whether that is true or not, can you have a really good career publishing in low or mid-tier journals? Yeah, you can. But many scientists feel a lot of pressure internally and socially to publish in high impact factor journals. I'd like to point out this article called Early Career Researchers and Their Publishing and Authorship Practices. And this was a study that presented findings from a 3-year longitudinal study of early career researchers. And what they found in this study is shown in this quote: "Underscoring previous evidence on the strategic importance accorded to publishing in high impact factor journals, the universal directive to do so is found to be the overriding consideration for our ECRs, or early career researchers." So in other words, these authors interviewed all of these early career researchers and found that one of the most important factors for where they decided to publish was journal impact factor. In addition, Nature Publishing Group did a survey called the Author Insights Survey, and they found that in both 2014 and 2015, the most important factors for authors choosing where to publish their work was the reputation of the journal, relevance to my discipline, the quality of the peer review, and the journal's impact factor. Now, the relevance to my discipline, this is so obvious it shouldn't even be on the list. You're not going to publish in a journal that's not relevant to your discipline. What makes up the reputation of a journal? It's largely the quality of peer review, or its rigorousness, in other words, its acceptance rate, and its impact factor. So really, these are all the same. Another figure from this survey actually states that factors that contribute most to the perception of a journal's reputation are impact factor and seen as the place to publish the best research in my community. And so the impact factor is at the top of this list. So the impact factor is the most important consideration for most researchers when they decide where to publish their journal article. Now, a high impact factor and a high rejection rate gives those journals prestige in the community. And that is evidenced by this article that was published in the London School of Economics blog. And the quote I would like to point out here is, "High rejection rates, if not always quality, imbue prestigious journals and publishers with pricing power. As such, high fees in eminent journals may be criticized, but they would never be labeled as predatory, even if their business models may be economically exploitive." Well, I would say never. I am asking the question, are these high impact factor journals acting in a predatory manner when they extract high high article processing charges from the authors. We have covered the point that many scientists believe that publication in high impact factor journals are key to the career they want, that journal impact factor is one of their top priorities. Now let's look at this next point. Journals have been raising article processing charges, or APCs, at a faster rate than inflation. At a much faster rate, in fact, as we look at this figure from an article called Article Processing Charge Hyperinflation and Price Insensitivity. And we see the inflation rate in the United States and in Europe in the blue and red lines at the bottom there. And then we see the open access fees in the upper figure. And you can see that's a much steeper slope than inflation. So these article processing charges are increasing much more rapidly than they should if they were just keeping up with inflation. So there's a race to the top of prices. Now, a fourth point that I would like to bring in that was just mentioned in that article is that authors are not sensitive to the price of the article processing charge. What do we mean by that? They're just going to pay whatever the journal asks. If they raise the price, the authors are going to pay that extra price. Let's look at some evidence for that. Another article from the LSE blog called The Gold Rush: Why Open Access Will Boost Publisher Profits. A couple of quotes I'd like to point out that were in this article. In theory, competition between publishers should apply downward pressure on APCs, as academics should at least consider price when selecting a journal. But that's not happening. And this author did some additional research and saw no evidence that fee introduction resulted in any loss of article volume. In other words, whenever journals started charging article processing charges, they didn't get fewer submissions, which if you took Economics 101, you learned the law of supply and demand, that when prices go up, demand goes down. Well, they're not seeing that happen in this study. In the cases where journals suddenly started charging fees, or when they were formerly a traditional model journal and they switched to open access, article volume did not fall off. So authors are not sensitive to how much it costs to publish because they're not paying for it out of their pocket. They're paying for it out of grants, or their institution is paying for it. Another quote from this article that's very important is that the importance of journal prestige for career advancement gives researchers a strong incentive to publish in the highest quality journals they can. And since higher quality open access journals are associated with higher article processing charges, it actually encourages authors to spend more on publishing. So if they have to spend $3,000 instead of $2,000, they're going to do that. That's what this quote is saying. But you know, $3,000 is pretty low at this point. We're going to see some actual numbers here in a minute. The fifth point I would like to bring up is that most of the elite journals are published by for-profit publishers. They're not published by scientific societies that are operating on a non-profit basis. They're operated by for-profit companies. Now, I don't have a problem with people making a profit. I don't think that's an inherently bad thing, but it does give them a motive for increasing the prices much more quickly than inflation. And because there's no price insensitivity, there's nothing holding them back. The typical laws of supply and demand are not going to apply to this situation. So these prices could spiral out of control. Let's take a look at some data that I generated. So from the journals themselves, I got the rates of their article processing charge, and from a different source I got the journal impact factor, and I was able to match up that data for 2,471 journals. And you can see visually that there appears to be a relationship between journal impact factor and the price to publish in that journal. Now, some of these are hybrid journals, so the article processing fee is optional. So keep that in mind. But you can see that as the impact factor increases, it's associated with a higher article processing charge. Now, it's not a perfect relationship, and we'll come back to this figure and look at it in a little bit more detail in just a few seconds. But let's go ahead and look at the distribution of article processing charges. So what I have here are 4 of the big for-profit publishers. I don't want to name them specifically because that's not what this video is about. You know, I'm not looking to attack any of these publishers directly. I'm just looking at the overall trends in the industry. There's pretty much a normal distribution. Some of the journals are pretty inexpensive, less than $500 for a few. Some of them are less than $1,000. And a lot of times the prices are low when a journal first starts open access, and then after a year or two the prices will increase. So it could be that these are new journals. But what you see is there is a distribution. The average APCs for these 4 publishers are $2,065, $2,300, $2,800, and $3,100. One question that this distribution brings to my mind is, if article processing charges are there just to cover the fees for publishing and then a little bit left over for profit, why do they vary so much? Okay, why does it cost some journals $8,900 to publish an article where other journals can do it for $500? Something doesn't make sense. One thing I would like to point out with this figure is that most of the journals are clustered in this kind of a bell-shaped curve around the average. We do see that there are some outliers that are much more expensive than the average. So at the far right hand side you see that there's one journal that has an APC that is more than $11,000. That's Nature. And then the second highest one is nearly $10,000, and that is Cell. And then we have this cluster of 18 journals that have an APC of $8,900, and they're all from the same publisher. And then a little bit farther down, a cluster that's still an outlier, but a cluster of journals that are around $6,500. So what is going on here? So let's go back and look at this scatter plot, and we can see that among those journals that are $8,900, they're not just high impact journals. They're kind of spanning the range. What I would predict is that over time, the impact factor of all of these high priced journals is going to go up because authors associate a high price with high prestige journal. It's going to allow the journal to become more and more selective, and that's going to drive up the impact factor. And the same thing with this lower cluster that's around $6,500. Let's go back to the question. Can a mainstream elite journal be considered predatory? Well, I think if we look at the definition and characteristics of a predatory journal, the answer would be no. So they're not giving false and misleading information. They're not deviating from the best editorial and publication practices. They don't have a lack of transparency, and they don't have spam emails and other aggressive solicitation methods. So their behaviors are not on the predatory behavior list for the most part. But I think if we look at the Merriam-Webster definition of predatory, in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, these high article processing charges are definitely exploitive. And I think they're bordering on predatory behavior. It doesn't make them a predatory journal, but I feel like it is predatory behavior. They're taking advantage of the academics' lack of price sensitivity and their willingness to pay these high article processing charges to get into the best journals. All right, what do you think about it? Do you have a different opinion? If you can explain why article processing charges are so high and why they're having hyperinflation, leave a comment. If you have any questions about it, you can also leave a comment. If you got value from this video, please hit the like button and consider subscribing to the Grants and Publications YouTube channel if you'd like more videos about scientific writing related topics. All right, I'll see you next time, and happy writing.